Going into these conversations, I figured most of them would be about the usual things: strategy, enrollment, the budget, the hard institutional decisions. I sat down with more than 30 women presidents and senior leaders across these conversations, and what I didn't expect was how often we'd circle back to identity. In one conversation after another, they described leadership not as becoming someone new, but as becoming more at home in who they already were. It started for me with a single word. It came from Pam Eddinger.
And back then, the whole identity conversation was about acculturation, right? So I go to Barnard, I go to Columbia, I work for community colleges. I learned how to do leadership. And I think parallel to that, my acquisition of the American dream, or my understanding of the American dream back then, was that you fit into the American dream, right? You do not carry a dual identity, and that's how you get into a system. I never questioned the fact back then that the system was not built for me. Why wasn't it built for me? That was never a question. But once I have more experience, particularly over the last 10 years, I realized that a lot of the skills that I have is cultural, right? The idea of the meeting before the meeting before the meeting to resolve conflict, the respect for experience, the respect for age, the respect for community. All of those things I carry with me, and that I activate them without naming them. But I lost a great deal, I think, of that cultural identity in the beginning. And it's interesting being able to reclaim it now.
Reclaim, not reinvent, not transform. That word stayed with me. What gets me about Pam's story is that the things she's best at weren't simply skills she picked up later. Some of them had been there all along. Leadership meant recognizing their value and bringing them forward. And I heard a different version of that in Elsa Núñez.
And at that event, there was a woman. I'll never forget. I was standing in the library building, and a woman who looked Hispanic was standing in the doorway. And as I passed by, she touched my hand. And Melissa, she said, "God sent you here." Over time, since the late part of the 19th century to 1960s, Puerto Ricans had migrated to Connecticut to work in the tobacco fields, in the factories, and the chicken factory that existed in Willimantic. And that chicken factory was the largest chicken factory in the world. And the thread company was the largest thread company in the world. And so those factories attracted a lot of people. And what had happened in Willimantic was what happens with a lot of minority communities, with the Irish and the Italian. One person gets a job and then they send a note to their family or their friends, "Come, you can work here." So over time, the Hispanics that were going to Willimantic to work, either the chicken factory, the tobacco fields, or the thread factory, were from a small town. And that town in Puerto Rico was called St. Sebastian, San Sebastian. That's where I was born and raised. And that's where all my family is from, this little mountain town. It's not on the water. And so that woman, when I realized that, I said, "Oh my God, I understand what she meant." And so I said, I need to do something that's much deeper, based on why I'm here. Why there must be a reason why I'm here. That woman was right. And I said, I need to help children in this community. And so I said that would be my focus, that the high school counselors would identify for me young people who have the intellectual capacity, but not the opportunity to show their intellectual strength.
What stays with me about Elsa's story is not simply the remarkable coincidence, it's what she did with it. Her identity helped her notice people whose ability might otherwise have been overlooked. It shaped what she refused to walk past. And sometimes identity operates in another way entirely, simply by allowing someone else to see what is possible.
I know the importance of representation. and representation matters. And to be able to see someone that looks like them in some cases, maybe it's gender, maybe race, ethnicity, or whatever, to say if Marquita can do this, then maybe I can as well. So that really kind of led me on that path of representation mattering, and to not only have a seat at the table, to be at the head of the table, to bring others hopefully around the table too as well. That first off, you have to get rid of the imposter syndrome. You belong in that space. Your voice matters. If they've invited you in, use it. But being the first, you're the first. When you look around the room and you see that you are, or you're the only, if not the first, in some cases too, being the only. What are you doing with that opportunity? You have a responsibility and it is a privilege. How are you using it to not only bring light, but making sure that you're using it to bring others with you?
I used to think that when talented people held themselves back, the issue was mostly confidence. Marcheta made me rethink that. Sometimes you can't picture yourself in a role because you've never seen anyone else who shares your story standing there. Representation changes the picture. Hilary Link gave me another way of thinking about that relationship between identity and perspective.
So growing up, I studied languages. I did a lot of Latin and I did a lot of French. And when I got to college, I picked up Italian. And I spent my junior year studying abroad in Florence, Italy. And it was truly that life-altering experience where I found my voice literally in another culture and in another language. But what's so interesting, in the end, my graduate work ended up being about the intersection of Renaissance theories of perspective and Italian literature. And I talk a lot about perspective in the writing that I do, the speaking that I do, and even as I lead institutions, because to overly simplify what Brunelleschi and Leon Battista Alberti in the 1430s wrote about when they talked about how do you create a sense of depth and time in a flat painting. What they really said was you change where you're standing and you see something different. The other piece of it is being, I think I would say, my authentic self. This is who I am. It's who I am as a spouse. It's who I am as a parent. It's who I am as a friend. And it's who I am as an institutional leader. And I'm very much Hilary when I walk in the room.
That's the combination I kept hearing. These women weren't becoming more themselves by closing themselves off from other perspectives. Quite the opposite. The more grounded they were in who they were, the more able they seemed to see through somebody else's eyes. And Beverly Daniel Tatum gave me perhaps the clearest example of what can happen when you spend a lifetime moving between perspectives.
But I grew up in a town where there were very few Black families, and I was often the only Black child in my class, but also often the youngest kid in my class. So I had the experience, but yet I had this sort of privileged background of, being in this small town known as Dr. Daniel's daughter, right? And then Mrs. Daniel's daughter, right? In terms of my mom becoming a teacher in the school district. And so I think I had a lot of insider and outsider experience at the same time, sort of being able to see the world through the lens of an outsider as someone who in some ways didn't fit in to the wider community, standing out as different, but at the same time being an insider because I had all the privilege that was associated with educational access and that being a major part of my background. So I think my writing about race is informed by both that insider and outsider view, sort of trying to both understand the perspective of the dominant group and also having lived the experience of someone who was viewed through the lens of a minority category.
Going back through all of these conversations, one thing stood out to me: how rarely these women talked about leadership as performance. Almost none of them described building a persona or turning into somebody else to do the job. The movement was the other way. Pam reclaimed a cultural identity she'd once learned to set aside. Elsa discovered that her own story connected her to the communities she had been called to serve. Makita reminds us that simply being visible in the role can widen what's possible for somebody coming behind us. Hilary found her voice somewhere else and brought that voice fully into the way she leads. And Beverly learned that living as both insider and outsider could become a way of seeing people and institutions more clearly. Their stories are very different, but the direction is the same, toward themselves, not away. Maybe we've defined leadership development too narrowly. We tend to think it's about acquisition, the next skill, the next competency, the next thing we don't have yet. But these conversations suggest there's another part of leadership development, learning to understand and trust what we already carry. Which brings me back to Pam's word, reclaim. Not reinvention, not transformation. Reclaim, becoming more fully yourself and learning to lead from there.